Controlling the blur. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the controls inside of the blur pane. This controls the actual appearance of how the area that's out of focus, or the blurred area, or the bokeh actually looks. The focus bug is used to pick the sweet spot, the area that's going to stay sharp, but what the blur actually looks like is controlled by the blur pane. I'm just going to adjust my focus bug so that it covers the roadway at the bottom of this scene, protecting it, but letting the buildings in the background go out of focus. And I'm actually going to make this pretty tight here so that we really only have a small area that stays in focus, because we're really focusing on the area that's out of focus in this tutorial. All right, let's go over the controls inside of the blur pane. The first one is the blur version. The default is going to be version 2 for FocalPoint 2. However, if you're a user of FocalPoint 1 and you like the way that blur looks, you can go back to version 1's method by selecting version 1. You'll notice when you select version 1 that a lot of the controls are going to disable inside of the blur pane. You'll be able to adjust the amount of blur, and you'll be able to control the amount of motion, whether you want a smooth out of focus look or more of a motion out of focus appearance. Let's go ahead and go back to version 2. When version 2 is enabled, you'll still have the same amount and optic quality sliders. The amount is simple. It's just the amount of blur, or how much things are going to go out of focus. At a low blur amount, you'll see how there's a slight blurring. The highlights stay relatively small. As the amount increases, the area that's out of focus is going to get more and more out of focus. The depth is going to continue to increase. And if I set it really high, you can see how it becomes just an unrecognizable blur. Underneath the amount is the optic quality. The optic quality is kind of hard to describe. It's kind of the secret sauce that helps it simulate certain lenses. I'm just going to increase the amount pretty high here, and I'm going to bring up our highlight bloom, which I'll talk about in another movie, but it's good to have a really obvious out of focus area to describe some of these blur controls. The default for optic quality is going to be set at 0. And if I bring the optic quality to a minus number, you'll see how the aperture-shaped highlights start to become more hollow in their shape. Their shape is still well-defined, but the centers start to soften. If I take the optic quality in the opposite direction, towards a positive number, the actual edge appearance of the highlights is going to become softer and more muted. Now, the shapes that we're seeing in the highlights are actually the shape of the aperture. And if you think about the way a lens works, every lens has an aperture inside of it that controls how much light goes through it. And that's really the shape that governs what things out of focus are going to look like. Different lenses have different numbers of blades in their aperture. You can control that by using the aperture pop-up. And you can select anywhere from 3 blades up to 11 blades. Most modern cameras have 8 to 9 blades in their apertures. I'm just going to go ahead and select 8 sides. And you notice how the shape now changes to an octagon shape. As you change the aperture, you'll be able to preview what it looks like right here in the aperture preview pane. It'll show you the number of blades, the curvature, rotation, and even the optic quality. It's a good idea to watch this to understand how your adjustments in the blur pane are going to affect the aperture itself. Underneath the aperture pop-up is curvature. The curvature is going to change the shape of the curvature of the aperture blades. At its neutral position, each blade is flat, and as I start to increase the curvature, they're going to become more rounded. In a lens, at wide open apertures like 2.8 and larger, the aperture shape is going to be almost round, going all the way up to the maximum 100% curvature. You'll see how the highlights take on a very smooth, round shape. As the lens starts to stop down, the blades become more obvious. And when you have your lens stop down to f11 or f16, you're actually going to have fairly square edges, very hard edges. You can also, in FocalPoint 2, decrease the curvature so that they actually become concave. Now, this won't happen in a real lens, but it does have the benefit of giving you some creative control over the shape of those highlights. So you can see we can actually give them more of a starburst shape. Below curvature is rotation, and rotation allows you to rotate the shape, and depending on the number of blades that you have in the aperture, it can be advantageous to control the rotation. For example, if I change to 5 sides, I'm going to create a 5-sided star. Let's change our curvature just a little bit here. Let's bring our optic quality down, and you can see how I can create a very patriotic star shape. And then by adjusting the rotation, I can control how those different star shapes are rotated. All right, now that looks a little silly compared to what we'd actually see through a lens. I'm going to hit the reset button, and I'll show you what I'll typically do. I'm going to use the lens pop-up. Right now it says custom, but when I click on it, you'll actually get a list of common Canon and Nikon lenses. And these are some expensive, high-speed, high-aperture lenses, which are pretty expensive. We've gone out and measured them and determined how they're going to blur. We know their aperture shape and their optic quality and all the settings to make it look like a certain lens. Now this image was photographed with a wide-angle lens, so I'm going to pick a Canon 35mm 1.4 lens, photographed at 1.4. And you'll notice how it sets the number of blades, the curvature, the optic quality, and the amount for me automatically, so that it looks just like what it would look like if I photographed the scene with that particular lens, even though I may have had a different lens on at the time. Alright, that should give you a good handle on how to control the appearance of the blur in FocalPoint 2.